Hello and welcome to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke, an ongoing conversation between two normal Christians who are making sense of a world in chaos. My name is Luke, and that is not Mike across from me, but it is in fact the return of David, a friend of mine. Today we're going to talk about Benny Hinn. Is he going to heaven? That's not up to us. But we'll also maybe cover Werry's Law if we can get to it this time. And an opening question, what percentage of Americans call themselves Christians or who would agree with sort of the fundamentals? You had some survey results.
Well, first, let me see what percentage.
What would I have guessed?
Yeah, what do you guess? So what percentage of people do you think? So
Okay.
this is voters, and this is a survey that was done by Scott Rasmussen.
Okay.
Who's the guy who started Rasmussen, one of the top polling companies in the world, but now has his own called RM,
And so he's not just
RMG.
polling Christians.
No, he's polling voters.
Okay,
So likely
okay.
voters. So likely voters in America.
Yep.
What percentage do you think believe this? The man known to history as Jesus Christ actually existed and walked on the earth. What percentage of voters do you think it is?
See, I've already seen this, spoiler alert, but
Okay.
I would think most people think that.
You think so? Okay.
Yeah, it's the later questions that
All right.
get
So
me.
then let's get to one. Okay.
Now, keep in mind, we do live in Oregon, one of the
Yes.
least churched and most, not even liberal anymore, but fully leftist states in the union. So our sense of things is a little skewed. What were the other questions?
Okay. So maybe Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead. What percentage?
That's a big one.
What
I would not. I mean, 50-50 maybe.
50-50?
Yeah.
So true number of people who said this was 68% of Americans.
68. So higher than I thought.
68%. Only 13,
Almost 70%.
Only 13% were willing to say false.
Keep in mind, it is an older demographic who are answering phones. I'm assuming this is a phone-based
I don't know what it was.
survey. But surveying is
Yeah.
really hard in the world of
Yeah.
cell phones, and nobody answers phone calls they don't recognize, or at least few people do.
I would
And-
say I'm guessing like Scott Rasmussen just because he's been doing it long enough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I think a lot of these polls to some degree seem to be getting a little better than they were like in 2016.
But you
know,
would
where they
agree,
miss-
and it's an older demographic who's going to still believe in these fundamental questions of who Jesus is and what he did.
I don't know. I'd like to see the cross section of like by age.
The cross section.
You know, like you actually see like by age how many people.
Was that an Easter joke?
Let's just say there's like this is 5%. Let's say it's 60%. Say it's 60% of Americans believe that, and it says 75% of Americans think that Jesus Christ died for your sins.
Right.
Which is a very specific like way of putting that he
Mm-hmm.
died for your sins. 60% of people physically rose from the dead, and then 65% say he walked on water. Right, like the people are believing
Kind of the most famous
gospel,
miracles. Yeah.
right. Like what? So does that surprise you? That number
So
of people?
it does not surprise me. And I'll tell you a story. One of my first teaching job, just out of college, was at a private Christian school. And having gone to public high school, public university, and hanging out with these Christian teenagers who were going to Christian school, Christian church, all their sports teams were Christian kids, youth groups on Wednesday nights, they thought everybody was Christian. And I was sort of like looking around the room like, you guys are kidding, right? And so what I did is I created a survey, and it started with these questions. And it was like, who is Jesus? Did he raise from the dead? All these fundamentals. And then it said, does that impact your view of morality? Does that impact how you vote? Does that impact, like, how does it change your life, essentially, right? That was part 2 of this 10-question survey. And then I required that they go ask 10 strangers, wherever you want, just go find 10 strangers and get them to do this survey. And they did. And they all come back wide-eyed and shocked. Almost everyone said, and this is in Corvallis, Oregon, almost everyone agreed Jesus is the Son of God. He was raised from the dead. He died for our sins. And it has no impact on my moral life. It has no impact on how I vote, nor should it on anyone else's.
Wow.
So what they're doing is, this is the best I could take. What they're doing is when you ask that type of question, they switch into a Sunday school mode of, what's the right answer? Yes, he did walk on water, right? And it becomes almost like a movie that they saw, and they're trying to remember what happened in the movie.
To me, it is so surprising, and just because because I have been seeing these stats, about church declining, about all of these other things, right?
Sure.
We're living what feels like
Post-Christian America, for sure.
Post-Christian America. where all the fabric is ripped out. And what's so surprising to me is like, well, how would this actually affect like something like evangelism? Like if you actually went that approach of saying, starting with these questions as opposed to, do you know Jesus?
Right.
Right. Because if you're going around Corvallis and you're getting 7 out of 10 people saying, no, I do believe in Jesus. Do you believe he died for your sins? Yep.
For those who are not from Oregon, by the way, Corvallis is quite leftist in their perspective of things.
It's not. It's a college town. It's a liberal town. Or I wonder what that question would be if you went to Eugene or Portland. I'm sure it would go lower, right? If you're in Portland.
In Portland, it'd be like, "What are you, a fascist? How dare you ask me this?" Which is of the stark left people that I still associate with and hear from. Christianity and fascism are now, in their perspective, one and the same.
Yeah,
which is crazy, but another topic entirely.
It is, but it's the idea of cultural like Christianity of like what is it? What is that disconnect between the way that we've taught belief, maybe the idea of like what is that you can somehow think, oh, I'm affirming these things,
right?
And maybe because I affirm these things, I'm good, yet be not good, right? Because if it's not surrender, it's such a sad thing. Actually, it was what has really like stuck with me is like this idea that these people could believe these things, could say yes to all of these questions. Yes, he physically rose from the dead. Yes, he died for my sins.
Right.
And yet not actually be followers of Jesus.
Well, and that's
because
where
they've been maybe taught that that's not actually what it means to believe.
Well, what they've been taught is Jesus loves you and has a plan for your life. Right. And nowhere in that simple version of the gospel is it require you to do anything.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge of communicating what grace is from a biblical perspective.
Right.
Right. That your salvation is a gift. And hopefully you don't have to earn your Christmas presents, right? You don't have to go to work so that you can pay them off. And that's how the gospel is communicated rightly. But the way you see, I think often of Peter's sermon to the Jews after Jesus ascended to heaven. So this is the day of Pentecost. It's the early chapters of the book of Acts. And their reaction to his sermon is they were cut to the heart, convicted, right? They were rebuked publicly for their wrongdoing. And their response was a humble submission to the rightness of Peter. And so what we're doing instead and I think this is where we misunderstand servant leadership from a Christian perspective, is we say, as people that want to convey Christianity to a non-believer, we're submitting to them in hopes that they'll favor us and what we're trying to persuade, rather than requiring them to submit to the message that they are wrong and need to stand before God with a humble and apologetic stance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you could have, yes, I believe X. I believe A and B.
Right.
But we haven't taught what then must I do. Right. Which is at the end of that thing in Acts where he gets to that point where he's just cut to the quick. Yeah. I think it's probably just maybe a lack of understanding of sin, a lack of understanding of that actually he did die for your sins, but that doesn't mean your sins are covered.
Well, I don't think the English language is good at conveying the difference between agreeing and believing.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
100%.
I remember when I was really diving into understanding what effective teaching is. There was this phenomenal professor whose name I can't remember, but I'll look him up. And because if you're a teacher and you want to know how to teach really well, this guy is amazing. He was teaching at MIT physics, okay? Smartest kids, straight A students. And he started asking them these everyday questions that would apply the physics that they should know. And what he found is they couldn't do it. They couldn't answer even these straightforward questions, right? So if you're familiar at all with, well, I don't want to get into the physics just because it's too much of a side. But he was asking questions that if you understood what that had been taught, and he knew they did because they were getting A's on the tests. So now he's asking a question that applies what they claim to understand, and they couldn't apply it. And he realized they weren't learning physics. What they were learning was how to take which values from the problem and put them into which equation and get the correct number. But they couldn't actually look at the real world and use what they had learned. Therefore, they didn't really know it.
They didn't really believe it in like
that it was real.
The biblical sense of basically it's like you surrender to it, you trust it, you live your life according to it.
That's right. Yeah.
Not just I agree that this
And I can get the right answers on a quiz.
Okay, so let me push this a little further. So how wrong is the leftist when they maybe see a culture that says, I believe these things, right? I believe Jesus, I believe in these things, yet is not surrendered to it. How wrong are they to say that's not actually the prime ground for fascism? Because to me, that actually sounds a lot like what Germany was. In the lead up to Hitler.
This crossed my mind too, is the idea that what I see now in surveys and some online is a lot of young men who are leaning heavy to the conservative wing now, right? In sort of rebellion against their female classmates in large part. And if you look at unmarried people, it's the sex differences in voting and politics is really dramatic. And what I also see is a lot of people like embracing this weirdly like the Crusades, pro-Crusades version of Christianity, which I think Crusades get a bad rap, to be honest, in a lot of ways. But I'm not out here saying let's go to war against the infidel, because that's not the gospel. It's not Christianity. Now, a Christian nation might go to war to defend themselves, but you're not going to spread the gospel with war. You cannot. It's impossible. Right. But that's sort of this macho embrace of Christianity as a cultural identity, not really as a religious affection. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so in that way, yeah, you could see that's ripe for this fascist ideal, which is this, and we had this conversation today at school. We were discussing meritocracy, what it is and how it works. And the difference between a coach on a sports team is how we laid it out, who we know coaches are going to favor the kid who's best at the sport because coaches want to win, right? Versus the teacher in the classroom who's going to favor the lowest performing kid to help them up. And all these kids, they're all middle and high school, agreed we want a teacher that helps the lowest performer and we want a coach that helps the highest performer. And I said, okay. And this is always telling, but and a little bit dangerous. Raise your hand if in your family, think of the family, your family and the families you're familiar with, right? Your friends, you go to their house, you know both mom and dad. Is mom or dad more likely to be the teacher who helps the low performer? Mom, they all agree. Is dad more like, right? And so this is that, the battle of the sexes and the battle for culture are this weird extrapolation of the same ideas. And so men in their worst behavior, in that domineering masculine, is fascism.
Right.
And women in their most manipulative, underhanded, that is communism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is like the it's the Übermensch, right? It's like this. Is that the right word? I think it's the right word.
Yeah, the Superman.
It's the Superman, right?
Yeah.
That is like in its fullest form. That's the coach who's gone way too far.
Too far. That's right.
And I'm going to create and nourish that Superman, that one extraordinary.
And you know what sparked the conversation? So I've been looking for what's better ways that I can undermine communism with my teaching. And I do it fully out in the open, right? The parents all know, and so do the kids. I almost want to make anti-communist t-shirts, but I haven't gotten that far yet. We're reading Hunt for Red October. And if you haven't read the book, you've only seen the movie, you wouldn't know this. I didn't until we're reading it. Is that the main character, especially in the opening part of the book, is this Russian general, or not general, but captain, sea captain, who resents the Soviet Union because incompetent people are put forth not for their skill at the work needing to be done. Yeah, sorry, the coffee's all gone. Not because of their skill, but because of their connections to the party. That your social connection is what promotes you. And the result in this story was that his wife died from a drunk surgeon who only got that position because his dad was in the party. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so that whole question of meritocracy is born out of this. Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole sidetrack.
That's so interesting. And I think there is this way in which I think both have this kind of shadow side, right? Exactly. It's like both have this really way that they can go sideways. And it's almost why I think circling back to like localism is that place where I think kind of both you need each other, and it's so small where you're like, I think there's a lot more hope in situations that are in that smaller.
And the case I make is that in a healthy family, you need that, what we were saying is the teacher and the coach, the mother and the father, right? You need both.
Yeah.
In God's design, obviously.
That's right.
In a healthy community, it's the same.
You need both.
And I would argue that you need progressives and you need traditionalists. You need both in a healthy community. What you don't need is authoritarians. And so the reason we get authoritarians is because we reject God's law. And lawless people have to be ruled. That's the lesson of history, if ever there was one. And as America becomes lawless, we will get dictators. We will. It's coming. Unless we repent.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna jump off from there.
That was a long.
I know we started with a survey. So, hey, if you're enjoying this conversation, you want to hear more, click subscribe so you can get our next episode sent your way automatically, or follow or whatever. I don't know. I won't get into it. Okay, yeah, like what we're saying and leave a comment if you are on like the YouTubes, because we love the comments. We love to disagree. I had somebody posted on one of our recent videos, our last one, that we don't disagree. He said, this is a friend of mine. He says, Mike's just so good at taking that 10% you disagree and making it the whole episode. And he thought it was really good. So we're hunting for disagreement today. We'll see if we can get it. David and I tend to agree a little bit more about things. All right, I wanted to jump into a really interesting perspective I heard from someone named Marcus Gustavus. I don't know if that's his real name, but he's a Presbyterian troublemaker on X. And he posted this thread that it's one of those things you've never thought of it. And as soon as you hear it, it rings so true, it immediately becomes the core of your understanding. Okay? And here's what it is. He was trying to figure out he was explaining why the Biden administration, maybe not Biden at all, because he actually sounded like he didn't know about it. Somebody asked him on Easter, why did your administration promote the Trans Day of Visibility over Easter? And he's like, we didn't, even though, yes, you did.
And I actually tend to believe him.
I don't think he has any say in what's going on in America at all. Okay, but why would the left?
Too brave. It feels just a little not Biden.
A little not Biden. Yeah. Well, it's because it's Obama. Anyway,
that's right.
Why would the left openly offend Christians in this way? It's not actually, this guy was arguing, it's not actually that the left is trying to rile up Christians, but instead that they're trying to unify their side. And here's what's dividing the left right now. It's the state of Israel. So the wealthy donor class and what he calls the muscle, the rabble rousers of the left, Antifa, the BLM movement, that the BLM movement and Antifa is intensely against Israel to the point of overt anti-Semitism. It's not getting condemned because the left has to protect their own, right? But there's a clear divide between this wealthy donor class of the Democrat Party, which in large, I would say significant portion of them are Jewish. The Jewish donors, Jewish people are wealthier than average by a good measure, and they donate to the Democrat Party far more. And nobody can quite explain it, to be honest. I've never heard an explanation that makes sense as to why traditionally Jewish people would reject the conservative side, because Israelis are very conservative. Anyway.
It is strange. Both parties, even in Israel, there's not really even a very far left.
The donor class of the Democrat Party and the left generally is pro-Israel because of the high percentage of Jewish people in that mix, whereas that's the divide. And so what the Biden administration, maybe Obama, is trying to do is unite them against their common foe, which is Christians. As saying, look, you guys are fighting over the Jews, but let's unite around who we really hate, which is Christianity.
Wow.
And I thought, oh, that makes total sense. And here was the threat. He said, if they can't unite around something, that the muscle are the ones who manipulate the election. They're the vote gatherers. Do you know what I mean? They're the ones who rabble rouse in the streets, but they're also the ones who go door to door and collect ballots. They're the ones who mess
Antifa and that crowd.
The Democrat rabble, right?
Yeah.
The muscle of the Democrat Party. Tradition, maybe 20 years ago it was mostly union people who were getting paid in the back rooms, and maybe that's still the case. I don't know, but I think more and more union folks are turning toward Trump, and so now they have this Antifa kind of more fringe people that they're involved with. What are your thoughts? That's a lot.
I hate to say I agree with you, but
yeah.
I mean, I do think that's a really interesting point. That really, like, what unifies that whole side is that kind of coming together against the traditional Christian, like mantra, And I do think it feels a little bit like what they also are trying to do is, I think that kind of where they're seeing the most bleeding is that extreme base. Like they're seeing real signs that concern them on, and also taking a look at, that is concerning. Now, to me, I don't know if it's still a good strategy, because you also have another piece of the puzzle that you're bleeding support from is the Muslim community. And I don't know if a trans day of visibility is like there's like this weird cross section they're trying to stitch together right now that's really hard.
But if you were to portray that as we're doing this trans day of visibility, not because we're pro-trans, Mr. Muslim, but because we're anti-Christian.
Yeah.
And now for, I think, a significant part of the Muslim community could get a nod out of that. Yeah.
That's true.
Right. It's a pretty crazy but real thing. One of the things I noticed is there's a similar divide in the conservative wing. That Trump sort of leans more or appeals more to the rabble on the conservative side and the donor class of the Republicans, the Mitt Romneys and the John McCains. They hate it. They're losing their grip. Yeah. But what I don't see conservatives having, at least not in large number, is a giant need for that rabble to you can have all the rallies you want, but that's not going to manipulate how the elections turn out. But if you're manipulating elections with people on the ground who are collecting ballots and doing that sort of thing, and they say, we're not going to do it for you, now the Democrats are in trouble. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. And I think it's something they're really worried about, to be honest, because you had basically Michigan, where it was hundreds of thousands of people who said, we're just not voting for anyone.
Right. I forgot about that.
I think that there is some real concern that they're going to be bleeding support. And it's one of the top issues on the far left. One of the top issues. And I also think it's why Biden is saying some more, he's really trying to walk that line of I'm condemning Israel to some degree, but I'm not going to stop supporting Israel.
When right after October 7th happened, one of the things I saw was a list of the donations that the nation of Israel has given to different political, politicians, candidates, and people in power. Biden was at the top. He has received a ton of money.
Wow.
And you can see it, that he was immediately pro-Israel, and he has put out some son of squishy,
he's been
but he won't openly criticize.
He will not openly say we do not support Israel. He'll never say that.
Right.
I don't think. I think the other thing that's, as I think about kind of this whole, I just lost it, but I had a thought.
Okay. Well, let's talk about one of the things you mentioned before the episode began. You and I are both on our respective city councils, and we see this in politics a lot too, and church, to be honest. Budgets.
Oh, sorry. I know.
Oh, you came up with your thought. Okay, before we get to budgets, go.
So to me, I think it does kind of highlight the spiritual energy, on the left. And I mean, I don't mean this to every liberal, right? But I think that this does kind of highlight the common enemy is because of, I think, the spirit of the age and the spiritual dynamic behind the scenes. That it's always been this way. I've always thought one of the weirdest alliances, for example, is similar to maybe the Jewish support of the Democratic Party, is this weird, and it's always been this way, at least for the last 20 years, between the Muslim community and
the Democrats.
And the Democrats. Yeah. Because on the surface, you're well, you don't agree about
anything.
Gay rights, trans stuff, divorce,
yeah, all that.
None of that stuff. But yet, I think there's this common thread, this common spirit, maybe that animates both sides to say, okay, well, there's something we can actually get behind, and that's
the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Enemy of my enemy, which is the spirit of God, right?
Right.
And that's always where you look for. It's always it's similar to communism, the communism of how communism and fascism always feel kind of similar, where you're but they should on its face be very opposed to each other, because one's all about equality, one's all about one person being the ultimate promotion of the ultimate human, but it's because common spirits.
And Animal Farm, right? Remember the ending where the pigs and the farmers can't tell the difference, look from one to the other. That's how communism works in the end. Once they gain power, they're making deals with fascists in the back room every time. Yeah. And that's why Hitler and Stalin can be buddies in the back room until they turn on each other.
That's right.
And now suddenly Stalin's fighting with us. Yeah. Okay. Let's get to budget season. One of the things that I hear leaders often talk about, and I hear this day to day as well, is this idea of when you get into the politics of budgets, people don't care or they don't see the power behind it. And what's your philosophy when you look at a budget for a nonprofit organization or a municipality? How do you look at it, and what do you see as worth fighting over?
So, like, I think we're going into budget season right now. Kind of, we're both on city council. I thought about this as well in terms of like on a federal level, like
we just passed. What do they call it? The omnibus bill,
right?
Where everybody just throws in everything that their district wants, and then it becomes this giant swollen budget, and they just pass it.
And there's, I've always heard people say, man, why is it that, you can vote for this person and they're going to say, I'm going to cut this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get it under control, I'm going to be different, right? Like Mike Johnson, right? Like, great example, man.
Speaker of the House
in
Congress right now.
Wow, this is a Christian man who quotes the Bible, and then he's going to pass probably the largest budget of all time.
Worse than Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah. And supports every horrible spirit of the age, demonic program out there under the budget. He funds it.
From Planned Parenthood to transing kids.
Yes. Yeah. For all of it. And one of the things, as I've gotten into, like, I think local government, I to some degree, I see the same thing. That there is this propensity to always say yes and to never say no. There's always this propensity to be like, you can't ever say no.
So what I see in the city council realm is that the city manager usually, right? The local officials, bureaucrats, people who actually make things happen, the executives in their offices, when they try to persuade elected officials, they're good at it. They say, okay, look, here's what you want. Here's why the budget I made and I'm bringing to you gets done what you want. And what you have to be careful with is, what is it that the bureaucrats want that you're not necessarily seeing, right?
Right. Well, this is on a federal level is exactly what happens. On a federal level, it's basically like, you love war, right? You love all this foreign spending. This is fantastic. Mm-hmm. You can keep all your foreign spending. That's great. And we just want all the domestic spending, right?
Now you're going to add to it that the security state also has a massive blackmail operation going over everyone in Congress that makes them vote for that extra large FBI headquarters and the Pentagon expansions of foreign wars, all that stuff.
For sure, like it's all of that. No, but like nobody, and it's not an issue that you really care about too. It feels kind of boring, and nobody really I don't think really people vote on it very much. Like, people aren't motivated to be like, I'm actually going to cut the deficit. Right. Like, nobody really cares until it really now gas prices are double and groceries cost $800, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe it did matter. And so on a local level, I see the same thing where it's like, nobody's ever going to come to you. Like, and this is where I start to realize no one will ever come. No, like the bureaucratic state, let's say that, right? Because let's say there is this whole like blackmail operation. The bureaucratic state will never come to you as an elected official and say, hey, let's cut us.
Yeah. Let's cut back on our budget.
I think we should lay off all these people. Right?
And there's a very obvious reason that's not political as to why that won't happen. And that is that if the person working in that job, and I knew this as a principal too, I got into being a principal because I believe in it. And therefore, I want what I'm doing to expand.
Right. I want more capacity. Right.
And nobody gets into a government job who doesn't believe in it, especially if you work your way into leadership.
Right.
Self-preservation it's not just a selfish, greedy impulse.
Yes.
There is that, but it's more that I got into this to make a difference, and the only way I can make a difference is if my program expands.
And that's a really good point. Yeah. Because I do believe I don't think that people are coming into this like with,
corrupt
intentions. Yeah. But you have to always but you have to know how much that's pushing against you. Like it's why everyone, it's like whatever. I feel like this is a very Reagan type feel, or I don't even know what Reagan was talking about. I wasn't alive, but this idea of like, it feels like a very old school fiscal conservative argument about like, man, you as a family, you need to cut things, right? Mm-hmm. You have to cut things, and we cut.
He's
things.
not from the South. Reagan's not.
I know, whatever.
Okay. From California.
It feels appropriate. But just that whole act, maybe the average conservative from the South. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like, we got to cut just your families on your kitchen table. You got to cut back your
That's Bill Clinton is what you
got
sound
to cut
like.
back Netflix, whatever.
Yeah.
But like that just will never happen on a federal level, or even on a local level, unless you specifically get like a little mean.
Here's the other thing that makes it hard to cut. And that is, day to day, as an elected official, you work with those bureaucrats 100 times more than you interact with the public.
Right.
And when you cut some program, the only people in the public that you'll hear from are the people who benefited from that program. And so that feedback will always be negative. So what it really comes down to is we as a people do not believe, it's that same thing we were talking about before. We would all agree, yeah, we need to stay within our means and we need to cut the budget. But when it actually comes to cutting something that you enjoy or that you appreciate, you don't want it gone. And so what's the motive?
It's true.
The only thing that will cut budgets is someone for a moral reason saying we have to do this. And that's why an immoral people can never have a balanced budget. I mean, that's really what it is.
I really like that. It's like immoral people can never have a balanced budget. That's such a good statement.
Because it takes that level of
belief. You
belief.
never think of budget as moral, really. You know what I mean? But it is.
Well, this is a conversation my wife and I have been having, being in this ministry position where we are scraping pennies together in ways that as a principal, I never had to do. We did early as a teacher. There's this temptation, there's this obvious opportunity to just get into debt all the time. And you can do that. You could do that for a long time. You could get a big debt and then you can write it off. You can declare bankruptcy. People do this all the time and just wash the debt and start again. And so if we had to have this conversation of like, okay, if we really believe this, that debt is slavery, right? That the Bible says, as much as possible, don't owe anyone anything except the obligation to love them. It's like, okay. So we have to not only wipe this debt, but we have to pay it as much as we can until it's gone and resist it. And now suddenly, instead of having this cushion of like, oh, well, we got a credit card. If the money doesn't come in, if things don't work out, suddenly now it's like, no, we have to trust God because the credit card's gone. You got rid of it. It's not even like, oh, we paid it off and now it sits there just in case, right? No, it's only God who's there now.
Wow.
That's a whole nother level of your faith that I never really faced before.
Wow.
It sucks.
It does suck.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because I definitely do feel like, and not that I'm in a lot of debt, but I've used, that as that crutch. And you do see that. You're like, it does kind of steal a little of that. It does steal that need.
Yeah.
To trust God.
And I grew up with stories my parents told all the time and hearing at church of God providing in these miraculous ways. And I think, how come I don't have those stories? Oh, yeah, because I have a bunch of consumer debt available to me all the time. Why would I need to wait till that last second and God, I hope you come through, and then he does. Well, he doesn't need to. Yeah.
That's good.
It's interesting to think about our faith is one of the stories we tell are we've tried everything and now we have to rely on God, and that's when he comes through.
That's right.
And that's kind of, you got to get to the end of your rope. All right. Hey, this podcast is a ministry of the Trinity School. We are a culture building enterprise that targets education, influence, industry, and the arts. If you want more information or if you want to support what we're doing, go to gracestaten.com/Trinity School. All right. Hey, one of the things I like to do is keep an eye on people that criticize us as Christians, conservatives, all the things that we think about or value. Because, like I was saying before, I think a healthy community needs progressives and conservatives both functioning and having a voice. And so I read something that a liberal, someone who works in the Star Wars world, like for Disney, that end of Star Wars, not just like a commentator. This person was talking about Star Wars fans and the new show called The Acolyte that Disney's putting out. And The Acolyte, I'm not familiar with it except for having watched the trailer. But the trailer is all the main characters are women. Someone who may or may not be the villain was talking essentially a line from the Communist Manifesto and leftist politics saying it's not about right and wrong, it's about power and who gets to wield it. And I thought, oh, I remember hearing that in the George Floyd craziness, right, of 2020. That's like a line straight out of that. And so all of these Star Wars conservative, I don't know if that's the right word, but they're diehard Star Wars old-fashioned come out of the woodwork to criticize and mock and say all the terrible things that nerds online like to say. And it got me thinking about this idea of, what do we do when someone who agrees with us on a big picture but fights dirty? What do we do? What should we do? Because I don't, there's this idea that goes around of no enemies on the right. Like, you don't turn and criticize people on your side, no matter how wrong they are, because there's a lot worse people over there. And that's not really a biblical standard. No. Do you know what I'm saying?
It feels to me like the biblical standard is more actually judgment starts in the house of God.
Yeah.
Like that feels a little bit more like that you actually should have a higher standard for people who are on your side. Now, the issue is you still do have to, like, on a practical level, try to maintain some sort of unity, right? Which is always like the issue.
And this does sort of get into the weird overlap or lack thereof between the house of God and political movements.
Right.
Pop culture commentary. That's not the church.
No.
But sometimes it's our side.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
So is there a principle there where you're saying, like, you're on the same cultural side, so how do you deal with the people who are fighting dirty on your side?
This is sort of the question of Trump and Christianity too, because Trump's very clearly not a Christian. His inner circle is anti-Christian in some major ways, but he'll also fight for us on occasion for what we believe in, some of the moral stands we take.
And I find myself almost sometimes, even though I've voted for him in the past and probably will end up this time, it's like
I'm like, come on, RFK,
I know
you can do it.
But his pick was
anyway. Yeah.
Anyway, that was disappointing.
His VP pick for those who are not in the know.
I was more pro Aaron Rodgers than her. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Although in some ways there's a benefit of the fact I do think it'll like take more from the left, but
nonetheless, do we criticize or should we, and how?
Yeah.
Conservative commentators who are jerks. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, like think about like David. Was it Dave Crowder? Was it Steven Crowder?
Steven Crowder.
Like Steven Crowder. Like that's a great prime example. Like,
and this is independent of his marriage and its ending. You're talking about his propensity to just be a jerk.
To be a jerk. Also, the marriage stuff. I think probably
where he was a giant jerk.
Like, crystallized it. Right.
Yeah.
But there is a certain sense in which you felt like he was a jerk, and the whole time you're watching him, you're like, this guy is kind of a jerk.
Yeah.
And yet you're like, I think we can keep him on our side until it ends up blowing up, and he actually is a jerk. Right. And he's like a jerk in a way that really gives you a black eye. And now, because you're now associated with him.
Well, and Crowder's a decent example, too, because he puts himself up as this Christian at the same time.
He does.
But the way he talks, the way he acts, you're like, what kind of Christian are you?
Right. Maybe he believes.
Maybe he would answer that survey.
Right. In what way does he believe? But he would totally believe he is. He would totally believe he was a Christian.
Well, but this also gets to this phenomenon of pundits who play act like they're Christians in front of a microphone so that Christians feel justified to join their audience.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? A manipulative, this is my audience and I talk Christian talk.
I think I was watching that Mike Winger video about Benny Hinn, and he just said, sometimes I underappreciate someone's propensity to just be willing to lie. Right? To just be willing to like straight up lie.
Wait, explain that. You underappreciate someone's ability?
No, he's just like, I always am giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, like there's sort of a naive trust.
There's a naivety that, oh man, they're telling me they're a Christian. They must actually believe they're a Christian.
And he made it, he was a jerk, but you want to forgive quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because he says he is on our side on things.
Yep.
And you're just like, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Which is not a Christian idea.
Which is not a Christian idea.
Yeah.
I don't think. But there's also this certain ability of like, well, we just become this infighting, on the other side, do you just become this infighting like...
Okay, so I agree with that, because if all you do is criticize, then all you'll get is division.
Right. And then sometimes you get like this David French approach where you're just like, you've spent your whole time just criticizing Trump. Or you get the Roger, what's his name? Roger
I don't know.
The guy from Anyway, let's just say David French is a prime example of kind of this never Trump
Russell Moore.
That's what
it is. Yep.
Russell Moore, kind of never Trump, Christian-ish.
And he sort of lost his mind and now he's full leftist.
Right.
He's talking about why Christians shouldn't be against the trans day of visibility.
Right.
It's like, what?
He was talking about how it's unchristian to be angry about it.
Yeah, you should never get offended.
You should never get offended.
It's the nice
never
guy
be
version of
angry.
Christianity.
Right. And so there's this way in which they allowed that kind of, okay, I'm going to have a critical thinking about Trump. I'm not going to like criticize, like I'm going to criticize Trump, my own side, more than that side. And now it's turned them all the way over to almost that own side. And I almost see that sometimes in myself. I'm almost like, I'm spending so much time criticizing Trump because I don't like Trump on a personal level. I don't think that he's good for the movement right now.
Yeah.
And I'm frustrated by it. And so I'm going to spend my time like criticizing that to some degree.
Yeah.
But then I also have this to take a step back and be like, well, am I also just blind to what over here we have literal,
Like sacrificing children in the fires to Molech.
Yes.
Yeah, and Steven Crowder's not nice. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's hard to get too worked up about it. I agree with that. One of the things too is,
but it also leads to compromise that can be really unhealthy.
yeah,
Like that's the other issue is that little leaven, like the little leaven leavens the whole batch, right?
the reality is that you can't build going to a little more political side, but I think it's true in Christianity too. You can't build a coalition of people that will back what you want to do without a positive vision for the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so being the critic, being the discernment ministry, it has a role, but it's limited, and you won't actually ever be a leader doing that.
No.
And a leaders is what we need.
It's true. That is, I think, the issue on the right in particular, just on from a political perspective, is that there is no goal.
And I wouldn't even say political in the sense that it's not about necessarily elections, but social change.
Yeah.
Which social change is, I think, number one outcome that the church should be looking to have in culture is social change.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
A moral standard.
Yeah.
And you don't accomplish that by moralizing. You accomplish it by giving a positive vision for what the world would be like if Jesus was ruler of every heart.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Which is not the same as saying you're bad and you're bad and you're bad,
Yes.
even though it's intermixed. And we talked about that before, that Peter's words cut them to the heart.
Right.
But his words were, you crucified the Lord of glory, but he is king, he is Lord. You should submit to him still. And they did.
Right. And that's in a moral society. Like I think about that too. Like there's a morality in that society. That's not.
You're saying first century Jewish culture.
First century Jewish soldiers. They're not looking to the Romans and saying, like, he's not saying that to the Romans. Like, you absolute sinners, which you could say by all standards.
Well, that's because he thought they were all pagans and
all pagans,
Gentiles
like
and
that.
get them out of here.
But he's saying that to people who would probably politically agree with him on things, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You'd have political agreements. But the fact is, what's more important is that Christ is king. And what's more important is that we get to that deeper level. But, it is because there is no... This is where, like, Christian nationalism, like, if you get into that whole thing, it's like, this is where if that's what you mean by Christian nationalism, if that's what people mean by Christian nationalism, a vision for society, if Christ was the king of every human heart.
Yeah.
Like, I want to, like, who isn't for that? Who's a Christian? Who's
if Christian
Christian?
nationalism means mocking Jews and which is what I also see, right?
Right.
I see a ton of solid Christians saying Jesus is king, and I think this is awesome, right? We want Jesus to rule in every part of our culture, of our lives, and that's our positive vision. And it's hard to sometimes build a coalition around that if people don't have a clear picture of what Jesus brings when he becomes Lord.
That's right.
But I also see a lot of, like I'm saying, not Steven Crowder, but more like Andrew Torba and some of the like far right kind of crazy, cringe, Nazis weren't so bad kind of people who want to glom onto our same movement.
Yeah.
And who will also name Jesus.
And so to me, like those type of people,
Yeah.
I think that fringe, and I would even kind of throw Tate in there too, like the Andrew Tates of the world.
Yeah.
I think there is no room for them. Like I would say, get out. That's actually what I would say.
You're not welcome in our coalition.
You're not welcome because it's not, because I just don't. You're just as much of an enemy, really.
Yeah.
I don't want your vision for the world either.
Which is what, I mean, I'm not an expert on George Patton, but I know at the end of World War II, he was a well-known and successful general. He said we fought on the wrong side of World War II at the end, right? Because he saw how evil the Soviets were.
Wow.
But a lot of people, I hope that's why. right?
Yeah.
I haven't read deeply into any of his writings.
I didn't know that he said that.
Yeah.
I didn't know he believed that.
As soon as World War II ended, he immediately wanted to attack the Soviets and was furious that we didn't, because he saw how evil they were.
He was also furious that like they got there first, and there was a lot of stuff around like that where like we let them get.
Well, because he knew their mentality, which was that everywhere that they fought and conquered, they considered their own.
Yeah.
Where the West was saying, okay, we freed France, so France can be free. They said, we conquered Ukraine, now Ukraine is ours. Right.
For
decades.
Years.
Yeah, for decades.
50 years.
All right. Let's jump to another topic.
So to put a
pin on it.
on that, there is a line. Right?
There is a line. And okay, so here was one thing I was going to add. 'Cause I'm not putting a pin on it, sorry. Is what I found myself doing, if I'm not careful, is white knighting. Where you see someone being out of hand, and if someone is, a Steven Crowder type or worse on the right, is being a jerk to you, I think, well, yeah, David, show him who's boss. But then if it's like Megan Basham, you know what I'm saying? Or Ali Beth Stuckey or some of these women who are on our side, I think, I have to defend them because of that masculine impulse. That's right.
Yeah.
And so part of what's on our side, I think, and I think this is good, is to say the fray, the back and forth is important so that people can see how corrupt and twisted they are. And so that doesn't it puts them down according to the rules. Do you know what I'm saying? Like no eye gouging, no fish hooks, no kicks to the crotch.
Yeah.
Well, in the real world, if you're fighting for survival, kick in the crotch. Do you know what I'm saying? And so I think I have to adjust a little bit of my willingness to say, no, that's not right. And obviously our voices don't have a lot of effect on a Steven Crowder or an Andrew Tate. But what I would see is a teenager in our circles who's rocking that Louder with Crowder mug saying, is that really the guy? Do you know what I'm saying?
Specific
yeah. Is that really the guy that we're going for? And having that conversation with the people that we influence.
Right.
Without moralizing,
right,
but portraying a Christian vision for the future that doesn't include those guys.
And that person has really believed that this person is a Christian. This person is who they say it is. And slowly that sinks into their psyche. Okay, this is an okay vision for what it looks like to be a Christian because they're a part of our side. And that's kind of the real danger. It's the wolf a little bit. It's the wolf in sheep's clothing. It's the people who come alongside and say, "No, I'm one of you guys. I'm one of you guys.
Yeah,
I'm on your side."
Well, and they
also you can be a polygamist.
Oh man,
you're just like one of the things. Wait, I thought we were against polygamy.
Was it last summer or was it 2 years ago when Andrew Tate kind of started to be a thing? I'd never heard. I started seeing him. I'm like, who's this guy? And I was talking to a friend of mine who's liberal and calls himself a liberal Christian, who was very alarmed at the time when I wasn't alarmed by him. I just thought, One of the things I said in our conversation, though, was if you call everyone a jerk who speaks the truth about the dysfunctional nature of the feminism that we now have in our culture, then the only people who will keep talking are jerks. The people who say, I don't want to be a jerk, will shut up. And now all you have left to make a rabble is jerks, right? And so we have to be willing, and I think we are now, as conservatives and as Christian men, to be labeled the terrible things, knowing that those labels don't matter and they don't stick on us. And because we have a solid group of friends who will back us, we can say what needs to be said.
That has been the change.
It is. And that is the Trump effect that's good.
That is the good thing that Trump's done.
Yeah.
Like if you want to point to one thing, I think people are way more willing to call out the trans stuff than they've ever been willing to. Than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Basically, I remember just even the gay marriage stuff. Even today, if you ask a normal conservative, hey, are you against gay marriage? What are they going to say? I have no idea. Because that whole thing was baked in. That whole time was no. You can't say that because you're a bigot. Don't say that you're a bigot.
You don't. Yeah.
Only mean people say that. And slowly that just psyche changed on just that average conservative.
Yeah, I remember somebody that same friend in another conversation was saying, wait a minute, if you were talking to someone who's in a gay lifestyle, right? He said you would tell them that they're going to hell. And I was like, dude, I don't want them to go to hell, so I have to tell them.
That's right.
That's the loving thing to do.
That's the loving thing to do.
And he couldn't get it over. He couldn't get through that.
Right.
Because to him, to offend someone is unloving by definition.
And I think at the beginning of this trans stuff, I saw that a lot more, where it was like
Yeah.
there was that unwillingness to be like, no, you can be whatever you want to be. It was the same type of arguments that were happening with the gay stuff until basically just like one day everyone was like, no, actually they're castrating people.
They're castrating kids.
They're castrating kids.
Oh my gosh.
And I think Matt Walsh, honestly, like,
it was a breakthrough for sure.
He really, him and Trump, but Trump honestly has
Well,
never been
Christopher
super
Rufo, have you followed his stuff?
I haven't as much.
Dude,
but
he's champ. He's a champion.
Yeah. But there's been these champion, and weirdly, it's like even though Trump has never actually been that outspoken on the trans stuff.
I know. Caitlyn Jenner goes to his house.
But he created this atmosphere as where I think people were just much more willing to be like, no, it's okay if you call me a jerk. Like, it's okay.
Yeah,
but,
right.
And then that provided more room for people like, dude, did you see Matt Walsh's thing? It's like, yeah, I saw Matt Walsh's thing.
Right.
You know. So.
And what I found a lot of people in the last several years of me being more of an activist for social change is what I would say.
Yeah.
A Christian missionary is because those are the same thing. Sorry, guys.
I love that, yeah.
They really are. But what I've seen is numerous friends and relatives coming up to me and saying, thank you. I didn't know how to put it into words, and then I read what you post. I see how you argue, and I think, oh yeah, that's how you need to do it. And we're just trying to be an example. And that is really the purpose of even sermons on Sunday morning. You're giving words to something that they know in their heart, but they can't put into.
We should talk about the effect. Maybe not this time.
Yeah.
Next time we should talk about the effect COVID has had on this too.
That's right.
Because I think COVID has had a real effect on this as well. Like the way that it's just demolished. To me, it was the last nail in the coffin of really believing anything or reading, like bleeding anything that like the media would say or what other people would say. You just were like, oh, it's all like I'm all done. I'm all done.
Yes.
Like I'm all done with like believing that I can only speak in this box that I'm allowed to speak in.
Well, it's the experts agree statement has zero weight now for me. Like, oh, experts think that? It's probably wrong. You know what I'm saying?
It has the opposite effect, right?
I remember I was watching this stand-up comedian clip where he was saying, COVID taught me that doctors don't know anything. And I was like, wait, what? Oh, yeah, I kind of think that. And he explained, right? He's like, yeah, they don't know anything. He says, is there any doctors in the house? And this guy's like, I am. And he goes, what are you specialized in? He goes, I'm a dermatologist. And the comedian's like, perfect. He goes, you go to the dermatologist, what do they say? Here's some ointment. Come back in 2 weeks, we'll see what happens. He's like, you don't know what's going on. You're just guessing. It's like every doctor's like this. And I thought, oh my gosh, teachers, it's the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the most important things I've found is, and I don't remember who posted this or where it came from. If I find it, or if you know, actually, put it in the comments, was the idea that every expert who sees their area of expertise described in the media, right? So I'm a teacher and I'm a math guy. If I see someone talking about education on the news, they almost never know what they're talking about.
That's right.
Every expert agrees that when the news talks about what you're an expert in, they do not get it right.
Yes.
And then when they talk about things you're not an expert in, you believe it.
No, it's
you think, oh, that's probably right. It's never right.
It's 100%. I mean, I remember seeing this a long time ago. Like any time the news talks about scientific studies,
yeah.
Like I remember doing this project in like high school and college where it was like, okay, this was the media clip about it. Now I want you to
go look at the actual study.
Look at the actual studies. And you're always like, that's not what the study said at all.
That's
like
right.
it's just the headline, right?
You know, the other side of that too, I got this from Scott Adams, is that the most uninformed way to gain information is documentaries. Because you can watch any documentary on Earth, and at the end, you'll be convinced they're totally right.
So true.
Until you watch the exact opposite view from another documentary, and now you're convinced that one's right.
That's right. I do love documentaries, though.
They're so persuasive.
Because I do love to be convinced of things. I love to get, it's kind of like, you know, the Mike Winger, I watched it for 4 hours, right? And at the end, you're like, well, I guess this is the truth, right? Because,
Yeah, Benny Hinn, maybe we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. I did want to say one more reflection on last episode. We talked about what's the cause of housing prices increasing, and I made the argument the cause is two-income households, and that two incomes creates housing prices that go up because people can afford more unless you're not married. And so you have single people who say, I'll never get a house. Well, yeah, because especially if you had two professional 6-income generating adults buying a house, and that is normal, then single people you're up a creek, right? And then it dawned on me, I wanted to follow that up with this, which is, if you look at a map of the highest housing prices in America and the lowest church attendance, I bet they would overlap pretty tightly.
Sorry, the highest
housing prices, lowest church attendance. Same thing, same area. All the coasts, all the major cities have the highest housing prices and the lowest church attendance because the church, the message of the gospel is that there are roles in marriage. And so you're far more likely, if you're a Bible-believing Christian, to be a one-income household so that the wife can raise the kids who came out of her body, for crying out loud, who she was made by God to raise up to a certain age and develop and nurture, right? And so these wives are free in that Christian household to do what God made them to do when they have children.
Yeah.
And obviously not every woman does, but I'm not one to make half statements, right? So I'm going to keep going. Okay, so it's interesting to say, if you think housing prices are too high, the authoritarian in you says there should be a law, but the reality is there already is. God put it in nature. And when we reject God's law, we need authoritarian governments to compensate. And that's almost always where authoritarianism comes from.
Yeah.
A people without moral frame need to be ruled. Yeah. Anyway, that was a quick thought. Anything that jumps out at you on that? You got to disagree with it somehow. Soft complementarian. Come on.
Soft complementarian. I do think I think you're generally right. Like,
Yeah.
I think the issue is that exceptions aren't we made the exception the rule, right? So whenever you make, so I don't think there's necessarily like a firm rule in scripture that's like a woman can never work or a woman can, because I think there are different exceptions probably to that situation.
Well, and the Proverbs 31 woman is making money.
She's
making
deals at the gates. And
she's
I
buying
think
and
that
selling.
actually, historically speaking, a woman was a part of like the money-making enterprise of the home. There was a holistic kind of small business that would be run out of the family farm. And a big chunk of that was literally managing your staff, i.e. the kids, and producing clothes. And like that was a great economic system, in my opinion, that the woman was doing work that absolutely produced income. Like that's true. And I do think there's probably exceptions to that rule, like generally in the world where a woman might be specifically in a certain situation called. But I think when you make that the rule of the land, which I do think it comes out of the sexual revolution, it comes out of all of this kind of shirking off of all of the normal designs. And when you make that exception the rule, then it's you're up a creek.
Yeah, in the 20th century, the technology that really made being a stay-at-home mom much easier. Dishwashers, irons, washing machines that would have taken hours a week, every week, all the time to sew clothing for crying out loud. And so now suddenly you do feel this lack of purpose that, okay, I don't have to run around like crazy. What am I doing?
Right.
What more could I be doing? And that's illegitimate. It's not sinful for someone, like my wife, when all the kids were in school all day long, I had no expectation that she's just going to sit at home and make sure every vase is polished and the light fixtures don't have bugs in them. No, she went out and pursued something that she loves to do.
And part of this did like coincide with the whole unsettling of America, which is the idea of like all during the 70s. So this was all like in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And it started even before that, but 50s, 60s, 70s, it really ramped up.
Yeah.
Where you had this sexual revolution that was starting to happen, coinciding with this low food prices policy, the buying up of land by big corporations, all of these things that were pressuring people off the land.
Farm subsidies, maybe?
Yeah. And so then you got to the city, and then your whole economic way of living, which was out in the farm, which was a whole family unit working together, where literally kids were an economic boon because they were extra workers to work your farm.
Now they're extra cost.
They're extra cost. And so now the woman, in order to help provide for the kids, may be needed to go into the workforce.
Well, you also introduce chemical birth control.
Right.
And so number of kids gets fewer, right? In theory, childbearing becomes an optional part of sexual activity. which makes possible the whole sexual revolution. It just could not have happened without
apart from that. So I think that I, in general, agree with what you're saying. I just think I would, and I would also say that it's a little tough. And so I think part of the reason too that I'm maybe a little more hesitant on like the full extent of what you're saying is because I think, okay, well then what if you live in the coasts?
Yeah.
Right? What if you live in these places where you're actually living with the consequences of others' sin, and so you're in this place where it's like, man, I feel this need to have to work so that we can have a house, so that we can afford clothes, so that we can afford food. And so now you're almost like pressured into this, okay, is it now a sin for me to go work?
Which is interesting because the goal of this would not be to put it on women as a sin to go work, although I think it is a sin for a woman to neglect God's design for her to manage the household well, right?
Yeah.
But you can easily do that in some circumstances, you can do that very successfully
while
work.
working. Yeah, absolutely.
I would instead put it on the men to say, look, one of the consequences of Adam's sin is that you will work the ground by the sweat of your brow. And now you're putting that on your wife, you jackass. Work harder. Do you know what I'm saying? And the moral imperative to just dump it on women is not true. What I do think, though, is it is feminism that bucks that any little bit of it that goes on them, whereas men are, I think, rightly, although not always,
but I mean, you
tend to say, "Oh yeah, that is on me."
Yeah, I mean, I think you are in a situation though where that's just not viable. Like, does that make sense? I mean, I think it's a good theory. I just don't think that you're in an economic situation where that's even going to work for a lot of people.
Well, what it means is
like just working harder.
The imperative. Well, the imperative that it puts on Christian leaders like us, is to say what part of our church's training are we training men to be leaders in their fields so that they can make the money that can let their wife stay home. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And say, okay, look, you get a decent job. Are you working that job in such a way that you'll be in charge soon? Or are you just doing it to the minimum like everybody else?
But there's a certain level, right? There's a certain cap to
There's
that.
a realistic limit.
There's a realistic limit to that
Yeah.
as you are in the middle of a culture being judged for its sin.
Yeah.
Right? Does that make sense? So
we all suffer by the sin of the...
So you can't just say like work harder because I think that also creates really unhealthy habits of workaholism, which I think is an issue.
Yeah.
Like among men, actually, probably more generally speaking than women.
Oh, without a doubt.
Where you can so easily disappear into your job. And it's like,
so my question is I think without a doubt, men are more inclined to be workaholic, but is it 10% versus 5%? Or is it 50%? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not a majority of men. When I look around at a majority of men, I don't see workaholism as a problem.
I'll say this.
Laziness
when
is
I
probably
was
more of a problem.
working in Salem,
okay,
it was.
Among the people you were circled around.
100%.
Working
like,
long
it was
hours.
a lot more common. I think when you're in urban environments, right?
Which is what people, I'm going to go to make it, right? If you can make it there, you make it anywhere.
Go to make it, right? In urban environments, it becomes much more
That's interesting.
common. In a rural environment, I think there is a little bit more of that.
Which is a little
apathy,
bit contrary.
Maybe apathy. Maybe that is like
yeah.
I'm not throwing rural people under the. I love rural America, but
No. I would agree with you that if you want. I mean, I remember making
ambition
as a young man. It was my ambition to like go. I wanted to move to New York, right? Be a lawyer and make money and do. And I think there is that narrative is sold to young people a lot.
Right.
And so it's interesting to think. Okay, conservatives live out in the country, but yet I look around at the conservatives in our area. And it's two incomes all around. You don't see less. But part of it is it's a conservatism. It's an Oregon version of conservatism, right? If you went to Arkansas and looked at conservatism there, you're gonna see a lot more traditional in the marriage roles. There's not much of that left here. Yeah, maybe that's true. I'm not from Arkansas.
I don't know. Like I hear it's.
If you're listening from Arkansas, let
I was
us
about
know.
to say I've talked to some people that live in Alabama and they say it's not much different.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? They just say like.
Because it's all the same movies. It's all the same shows.
Yeah.
It's the same
and
cultural
actually,
impact.
I've heard that they don't like it even more.
What do you mean?
Like in terms of like the person that I know who moved to Alabama, he's like, honestly, like I preferred a lot of the culture of Oregon because at least like the Christians were Christians.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's like in some, and maybe that's also why I'm so surprised by the stats we read at the very beginning of the show. Is because man, if I'm in the South.
Everybody's giving you the Sunday school answer, but nobody's living like it.
Everyone's giving you the Sunday school answer. And And how many guys, I mean, I know this is just one person, but like how many guys have a family at home, have the house, and just completely live 100% sinful carnal lives, in Alabama, like.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're going to see in Alabama, and I've lived in the South as a young kid, so my memory of it's pretty limited, but essentially it's still in Alabama or in the South, it's still a social advantage to go to the right church in town, right? To have some connections and get that job, and that's not the case at all in Oregon.
Not the case.
If anything, it might be a disadvantage. I remember when we moved to Eugene to start a church, I was at the opening of the year staff meeting, and somebody said, "Luke, what do you just moved to Eugene? Why?" "Oh, I'm helping start a church." And literally it went crickets. And one teacher goes, "You think we need more of those, huh?" And then it was just like, not an advantage.
100%.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you though. Generally though, like we need to work, the church needs to work a lot harder in places like this to build parallel economies and help provide those some social advantage to being a Christian.
And the reality is,
be able to build those connections and those.
And this is just like teaching. As the church's job is to create a balanced picture of a positive future, but then looking at the people that are in front of you and say, "Oh, you need more of this, and you need more of that." It's not a one size fits all for anybody in any culture.
And trying to also grapple with the kind of cultural sin and like situation that you're in, right?
Yeah.
It's like living as a Christian in communist, Ukraine, whenever that was going to look different, culturally than living in a Christian here, which is going to look different than living in a Christian in like Alabama.
All right, we're past an hour. We got to wrap it in the next, say, 15 minutes or so. Do you want to talk about pride or Benny Hinn?
I kind of want to talk about Werry's Law.
Werry's Law. Okay. All right, let's dive in.
I feel like this is a continuation of that conversation.
All right, so there's somebody I follow who has
although we did do a false lead in with Benny Hinn, so we did tease.
We do this a lot.
Yeah.
These professional podcasters actually get to all the things they are going to talk about. We go where the wind blows.
That's right.
In this podcast. All right. So Werry's Law, let me give it to you. It has 3 rules. Rule number 1, an evangelical man, and I think they're talking about sort of like mega church evangelical. An evangelical man will only speak out on a controversial cultural issue if he can do so by citing a woman who's already has. Okay? That's rule number 1. Rule number 2, every conservative woman with a public platform is on a trajectory toward liberalism. And rule number 3 is there are no exceptions. Oh my goodness. Okay. So the classic example of this for the last few years, I would say, was probably Beth Moore. Beth Moore, who, as far as I know, is not apostate in any of her teachings. Biblically, she still gives the gospel requiring repentance and salvation and all those things. But politically, she has shifted in the Russell Moore camp. In fact, I think they're buddies. Yeah. And so now this Bendel Werry is the handle on X.
Do you know that that's a takeoff?
Yeah.
It's Wendellberry.
So,
Bendel Werry.
Bendel Werry, yep. And Werry's Law. So he's now putting his sights on Allie Beth Stuckey, who has been criticizing on the right, sort of in the way that we talked about, like these guys are jerks. But the people she's criticizing are pushing back, saying, "Look, we're just pushing a biblical patriarchy. These are the King's Hall, I think, is their podcast."
Actually, she was going to be my example of like how this law is not true.
Yeah. So she was talking. These conservative, very conservative Christian guys were talking about the Bible's responsibility given to husbands to teach their wives at home about biblical things and to essentially lead their wives well around issues of culture and doctrine and those sorts of things. And so,
who is this guy? Who are these people?
This is Brian Sauvé.
Okay.
And his buddies. The King's Hall is their podcast. Haunted Cosmos is one of their other podcasts.
Ah.
Okay, so these guys are super conservative Christians. They don't even say we're complementarian. They reject complementarianism, and they say we're patriarchy, pro-patriarchy. Okay, so Allie Beth Stuckey gets a letter from a listener who says, this is a woman, a Christian woman, who says, "My husband is saying I shouldn't listen to your podcast anymore because you're too outspoken, too the Bible describes a godly woman as being of a quiet nature, of a submissive attitude. And what should I do?" This letter writer sends to Allie Beth Stuckey. And her response was to mock the husband and tell this woman to disobey her husband and keep listening. And so these guys are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Here's Werry's law at work. She's on her way left. She's undermining God's order within a Christian marriage. I thought, ugh. Because I would have given her as an example too. I've appreciated a lot of what she's done. Yeah. And she's active in the culture war, like like Matt Walsh maybe a little bit.
So I don't think that's liberalism. I think that's just like,
So their argument is she's on her way.
She's on
right?
her, she's on her way to
she's doing. She's the conservative woman
because you don't
on
support,
a trajectory toward liberalism.
Because you don't support like a misogynistic husband over controlling her wife.
Well, so what? This is really the question, right? Right. Is what is our right or obligation as husbands? At what point could you say to your wife, "I don't want you to do this anymore," and there's a biblical backing for her to be obedient?
I don't think that there's necessarily like so for example, I don't necessarily think that there's necessarily like she's like if you really would I given the same advice like as Allie Beth Stuckey did? Like I don't know if I would phrase it the way that she phrased it or whatever.
Yeah.
But do I think that because she gave that advice, I guess my point is like because she gave that advice because she was offended by an overbearing husband.
The real question is, was the husband overbearing or does he have a biblical basis to make that argument to his wife?
I mean, I think he's overbearing.
Okay. Just because you like Allie Beth Stuckey?
No, because I think it's like...
Like if he was listening to Rachel Maddow, if your wife was listening to Rachel Maddow and thinking she has a really good point, would you put your foot down then? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I don't quite understand the whole, like the idea of like... I should have been more prepared for this. So the way I think about it is that we are in mutual submission to Christ. So I do buy a piece of like the egalitarian argument. I think that that's a piece of it, right?
Okay.
And I think that I don't think that you're primarily responsible. Like I think you are responsible for discipling your wife to an extent. And as a husband to lay your life,
your own wife and no one else's.
Yes, your own wife,
just to clarify.
No one else's. But you are not ultimately responsible for her salvation. And you're not ultimately responsible for like everything she takes in. Like I don't think that you can say, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's probably a line that you could probably draw somewhere. I'm not trying to like but I think to be like, Allie Beth Stuckey doesn't like an overbearing husband who's like, I think, and kind of an on its face over controlling attitude doesn't mean that I think that she's on a trajectory towards liberalism.
Right. Yeah.
But let's have the conversation. I mean, I feel like we can dig a little deeper. Yeah. So what's the path? There's a passage, right?
Right. So that's what I'm trying to look it up.
Yeah. Be quiet and like, it's like,
you want to look for it and I'll say what I'm thinking, which is that I think as a husband, my job is to protect, right? Sort of like a pastor or shepherd, right? As the Bible described, is his job is to protect the sheep from wolves who might come in among them dressed like a sheep, but in fact want to devour and draw people away. And so I think I'm not a pastor per se, exactly, but I'm the pastor of my home. I'm the protector and the shepherd of it. I protect my kids from influences like social media or other things that might want to draw them away. And biblically, I see my role as also to protect my wife, not just physically, but her heart, and that people would poison someone's heart by telling them lies, things they would want to hear, but that in fact draw them away from God's truth. And so fundamentally,
what do you do? Right. This is the question. But what do you do when you aren't doing that? When actually what you're doing is drawing them away into error. You think you're protecting them, but really what you're doing is you are.
How would I know?
Right. That's my point, though. My point is simply like, okay, this guy, like from let's take two examples, right?
Okay.
One is Rachel Maddow. Let's use that, right? Okay, you're watching Rachel Maddow, okay? I might agree with you that, yeah, as a husband, in that context, you should probably have a conversation with your wife and be like, I would really, I think that this is not healthy for our home and to make that art. I do think that you should convince your wife. Like, I do actually think that. Like, I don't think that you should just say, no, it's not allowed, because I just don't think that's like healthy communication.
Is there any circumstance in which you think it would be right for the husband to just say, I say no?
I do.
Okay, so there's
Yeah,
some, there is something.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So, and I think probably...
And probably safety
I think
issues.
probably ultimately, if you couldn't completely convince your wife on the Rachel Maddow thing, I think I probably would like say, okay.
Right. And
Like,
so then the
this is just
question,
a negative
I
influence.
think then the question becomes,
But
there's
similar
a
to-
leadership question of like, okay, you can't do that too much if you're doing
Right.
that all the time, right?
Oh, well, then the question is, okay, well, then what if she what if she still does it?
You can say disobeys.
Yeah, disobeys it, right? What if she still does it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so then the question is, okay, she's not necessarily honoring. That's what you've said.
Right.
So then what do you do then?
Well, I think
Right?
the Bible, Jesus in what is it, Matthew 18?
Yeah.
Someone is in sin, you go to them. If they do not listen to you, you bring someone with you to be the arbitrator. And if they are agreeing with you, then that person needs to listen. If they still don't, you go to the church. Like it's the same discipline procedure.
I don't see it quite in that way in terms of like with a husband and a wife to that extent.
Well, because the argument you'd be making at that point is you are doing something wrong.
Right.
Does that make sense?
And I do think that
and that is the safeguard that Jesus creates among his people for when the person who is leading might be wrong without realizing it.
Right,
Because
is
that third and that fourth witness are going to say, yeah, I think maybe you're out overstepping.
But there's also this principle of bearing with people who are like, especially among husband and wife.
Yes.
Like there does seem to be this principle of, okay, there's going to be times where you aren't like, and I don't think the context, like I don't think there's this active, like there's not an active example, right? Of like when your wife is listening to one program that you don't approve of bringing the whole church to be like, you are in sin. Like, I don't necessarily think that that's like.
Well, at that point, the sin might be you refuse to submit to your husband, let's say.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. That would be the sin, right?
Yeah.
But there's also this question of like the bearing with the weaker vessel, the bearing with
living with your wife in understanding.
Right. Living with your wife and understanding. There's also this idea of like where Paul's like, when your husband's a jerk, like, and you can't necessarily change him. And I would probably put physical abuse in a different category, like that there is some. That's a different can of worms. But let's say your husband's a jerk.
Yeah.
Right. That doesn't give you a right to like leave your husband. Right.
Yeah.
And does it give you a right to like bring other people in? I think probably to an extent. But there's also this point of which when he's not changing, and let's say he's just unrepentant, he's not. Let's say your wife's not a Christian.
Right.
Like, right? And that takes it a whole out of this whole context, right? Let's say your wife has walked away from Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's say your husband has walked away from God. So
Well,
even
maybe, but what's the end of that process? If someone is in sin, you treat them as an unbeliever.
right,
Yeah. So how do you treat an unbeliever
who you're married to.
who you're married to? That's a huge question.
Right, and I don't think you divorce them. And I don't
I
think
would
you
totally
leave them.
agree.
Right.
You do not. Yeah.
And I don't think you like leave them. Because it says, I think the Bible says if you
have an unbelieving
if they're
spouse.
if they're willing to live with you,
Yeah.
like live with you, right? And so
But you don't have to take it to the most extreme outcome
Yeah.
to find a guide for how to behave now. Does that make sense?
right. And so
In fact, in many ways, it might be unhealthy to do that, to say, well, if I tell my wife I'm not comfortable with her listening to that podcast, that means I'm going to have to divorce her. You know what I'm saying? Or you know what I'm saying? That's not what we're saying. But you don't have to run all the way to the end to
right.
say,
And I think what we're trying
it's
to find
healthy
is
to
the
protect.
limit too.
Well, I think we have a
we're trying
limiting
to find the
principle.
limiting principles.
That first of all, there is a right circumstance in which you could say, this is not right. I don't think you should do that. And I'm putting my foot down.
Right.
And what's funny is if we were reversing the roles and saying, is there a time when it's okay for the wife to put her foot down? This wouldn't even be a controversy, what we're saying.
Right.
Because every wife in America does that on a regular basis, barring some few exceptions, right? It's a commonplace thing that we've all accepted. And what's funny is, I would argue that our reaction to it when a husband does it is a reflection of the insidious nature of the world, the spirit of the age, weaving its way into our Christian mindsets about marriage.
I think there's a piece of that. But I think that there is an unchristian. I think there's an unchristian co-opting of actually like misogyny. Into, and we're calling that the Christian marriage.
So I would call that the Steven Crowder effect we were talking about before, right? Is that people naming the name of Christ as an excuse to be domineering and to live out the curse of the Garden of Eden,
right,
where the husband is ruling over in an ungodly way, which is why Jesus says the world is trying to gain positions of power so they can rule over people. It's not that way in my kingdom.
Do we think that this husband right? And we're talking about very specific, is dying to his wife.
Is
dying,
laying down himself,
is laying
sacrificing.
down his wife sacrificially, right?
Like Christ does for the church.
Like Christ does for the church. And how does Christ act with his church?
Because
does Christ allow free will for his church?
Yeah, well, does he ever put his foot down either? It's both.
It's both.
It's absolutely both.
It's both, but you can't always be putting down your foot, and you can't always say, no, you have no free will here.
Yeah.
And that's what I think this man's doing. I actually think that is what pure patriarchal patriarchalism
the truth
does.
is, we have no idea what this man is doing. We have a letter that his wife wrote about her perspective to Allie Beth Stuckey.
Right.
And that is the reality of most of the time when we do this. You have to sit with people and see both sides to really resolve anything
To really
like
understand what's going on here. I think if I'm just taking what's being said, it's not that I would necessarily give the exact same advice to her that Allie Beth Stuckey did. Right.
Yeah.
I think that's probably I think that you would actually probably say, okay, actually, no, you need to keep working this out, and you do need to come to a place of agreement with your husband. And if that means you need to bring other people in because you feel like he's in sin, do that. Bring the church. Find where is that? And if you can you identify it, and do you have a supportive thing? And maybe it's just you have to submit and wait for your reward in heaven. Maybe that's actually what it is, and that could be
the same. I mean,
that could be true. That
you
could be true.
submit to a boss,
right?
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now it's your job is not forever. Thank God. Right.
And so I think what he is asking her to do is wrong. I think that is wrong. That what he's asking you to do is wrong. I don't necessarily think that the response to say now you shouldn't submit just because what he's asking you to do is wrong is quite the answer either.
Okay,
because I think there is the place.
Can you be more specific? And I don't want to. We don't. I feel like we're coming to something of an understanding.
We don't agree. We're not supposed to agree. I'm just kidding.
But when you're saying he's wrong, because the biblical mandate is describing a godly woman as one who doesn't give in to fear, right? Who learns with quietness and submission, who sees her beauty as internal and not external, right?
Yeah.
These are biblical things. And then there's a godly man.
I don't think that you can actually take the quietness and submission passage and apply it to everything. I think that's specifically in the context of who is a pastor and who is doing the teaching at church. That's what the context of that passage is. It's in Timothy. It says,
1 Timothy
a woman
2
should
something.
learn with quietness and submission at home. And that's in the context of saying the men are pastors. He's saying women aren't pastors.
Wait, what's the passage you found? Because I don't see it at home. I'm seeing it as...
and this is not even at home, I don't think. It's basically saying when you're learning at church, you learn in quiet and submission.
First Timothy 2:9, likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, good works. I want to pause for a second and say, one, it's talking about modesty, not in a sexual way.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of Christian men making the argument that modesty is about their own temptations and that women are responsible for that. I actually totally disagree with that.
100%.
The Bible does not make that argument. The Bible says, men, you're responsible for what thoughts appear in your mind based on what you see. But that the argument the Bible makes for modesty is not men's desire or their propensity for sin, but where a woman sees her beauty. Is it internal or external?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But anyway, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach. And he's speaking then about church.
He's talking about church settings.
Yeah.
And so what they do is they take this and they say, okay, a woman can't, I've seen people, patriarchalists, who then say a woman cannot read a book without my approval. A woman can't listen to a teacher without my approval. Can't.
Right.
That's not actually what this passage is saying.
Well, and the thing is, I wouldn't even give my children that much restriction. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I would give, let's say, an elementary age sons that kind of restriction.
Right. That's how.
And if you're treating your wife like she's 12,
right,
that's not a wife you got anymore.
That is my issue. That's
Right.
why I think that guy's in sin, is because I don't think he's treating her like a wife. I don't think he's treating her like one flesh. I think he's treating her like a child.
But if I was listening to her and thinking, my wife really listens to her and values what she says, and she's mocking this husband, I might have a conversation with my wife and say, I'm not comfortable with this. Now, what I'm not going to do is say, I'm going to go through your phone and make sure. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I would have that conversation. Would I make it I wouldn't make it a demand, but at the same time, if I felt like her pushback was such that
But Allie Beth Stuckey, my wife listens to Alibaba stuff like every day.
Okay.
And
does she listen to this podcast?
I don't know if she listened to this one.
Because we're going to need her feedback
Yeah,
too.
we're going to need her feedback. I have, and I've heard, and it's hard, to be fair.
Yeah.
Her voice is a little hard to listen to. But
okay. That's not what we're about, dude. Come on.
It's just, I can't quite, maybe it's so because she's a woman, but no, it's not. It's just the fact that like, man, now I'm going to be a sexist. Anyway, I'm the soft complimentarian. Let's just remember this.
I know. I'm taking all the sexist
my point is like
attacks here.
everything I've ever heard her like say, like everything I've heard her say, and I have listened to full episodes. I've listened to all these things.
Yeah.
It's like, would I be like, hey, you need to stop listening to Steve Dace because I disagree with something he says?
Well, because he's a jerk that time.
Yeah, because he's
Right.
a jerk that time, or like because he wants us to all move out of Oregon, right? That's one that
Yeah,
I
that's
get
right.
frustrated every freaking time I hear that.
He has backed off on that, I would say. But yeah, I agree.
But my point is like, I'm not expecting perfection
No.
from the people I listen to, and I don't think she's in a drift towards liberalism, like in any sense. I think she actually takes stronger stances on most issues
than a lot of conservatives.
than most men.
Yeah. No,
Like most men.
The reason I might identify with that husband, which I don't, but I might. In other words, I want to sort of reserve the right to say I think that's not sin, what he's doing necessarily. We don't know his heart, and we don't know what his pattern is. We just know this one time. Is that I would say, if I was watching anyone who I was responsible to care for, be drawn into an ungodly attitude, an ungodly perspective, and I said, I think it's because of this influence. I think it's right and good for me to say, I need to cut that influence out. Let's take a break. Do you know what I'm saying? I need to be able to do that as the one responsible before God to protect my home.
And to be fair, I have had conversations around, like, both Olivia and I have had those conversations when it comes to like podcasts.
Yeah.
Less around like the actual podcast and more around like, I think this is not necessarily a healthy thing to be listening to right now because of.
And I say all this to say, I've never checked in on what my wife listens to.
Yeah. But, and I'm not even saying that it's been like, but it's never,
Actually, that's not true.
But it's never been this whole, like, you can't.
You know
like,
what I
you know
did
mean?
a couple months ago is my wife was watching the If Gathering. And I just had this like, I think I need to know what they're about.
Yeah.
And so I had my headphones on and like one ear a little loose, and I was on my iPad as she's watching it. And as it went on, 99% of it was fine.
Yeah.
And then I had this little like, I need to look, what's going on now? And my whole spirit was like, this is weird. This is not right. And I engaged with her about it.
Yeah.
But it never got to the point where I was like, I don't think you should be watching this.
Right.
Because she and I have a really positive influence over each other.
But this is, to me, what God does. And I think this is also where the law comes in. Like, I don't think this is where it comes about. Like, this goes to the principle of like, when you're dealing with immoral behavior, like an immoral society, or children that are like under 10 or something, that's when God uses like laws. That's when he's like, I'm going to give you this law. I'm going to give you this thing.
Okay.
He deals, like, how does Christ deal with his church? Yes, he does say, like, you should do this. Like, come follow me. Come do this thing. But it's all in this context of relationship. He's not using the law in the same way that he used the law before, in my opinion. So to me, it's like what you're doing is the right approach. It's in relationship. Let's have a conversation about this. Let's talk about this. Let's actually like be discipling like each other in this.
Yeah.
As opposed to just saying like, I'm going to say, no, you're not allowed to, listen to this pretty conservative person that I just don't like the fact that.
Yeah, but what you keep going back to, and we do need to wind this up.
Sorry.
No, but I think it's still worth it.
It is our disagreement.
What you keep coming back to
it's our 1 point of disagreement.
I know, is that it's because it's someone who is so close to what we believe, maybe 99%.
Yeah.
Not because a husband should never put his foot down. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, there is probably
the foot is not the problem, as much as saying, are you putting the foot down in the wrong time and too much?
There is a place.
Okay, yeah.
I think where you can put your foot down.
It just doesn't seem like this is the one.
And
I agree with that. I don't.
And it feels like it is I think the fact, like there's, and I don't know the situation, right?
Yeah.
It just seems like it's probably like a symptom of a lot of foot being,
I know. Yeah.
being put down all the time. And honestly, I have heard patriarchalists, right? Like, and this is probably what's also influencing this, where like it's everything. It's everything.
Who are these guys?
It's every book. It's like Joel Wheaton's a really good example of this.
Okay.
Joel Wheaton's a really good example. He's a patriarchalist. And
I
he
think
literally
he's
says,
with-
I will not let my wife read anything that I don't approve of. I won't let her listen to anything I don't approve of. I won't let her watch anything.
It's sort of the
I won't let her
weird
speak in church in any capacity. Even that, I think there's literally a lot of biblical precedents to be able to prophesy in church and to be able to
Sure.
do testimony in church.
Oh, you're promoting. Yeah, women can prophesy in church.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that women can speak in church in a certain context, right?
Yeah.
Not
So he takes it too far. I would agree with that too.
right.
One of the things, and maybe we can wrap it unless you really want to interject, which is that, well, and do it if you want, but is that there is what I think of it as like circles of trust.
Yeah.
And I hate to feel like meet the parents here, but that there is an inner circle of people that you say, man, whatever they say, I'm going to consider it seriously, right?
Yeah.
So your pastor should be that. That anything your pastor says, if you can't listen to him and think he's probably right, and if I disagree with him, I need to consider it. If you can't do that, you probably should go to a church where you can. Honest.
You're right.
But then
You need to seriously be able to consider everything that person says. Not that you agree with them.
That's right.
But you're like, I respect where they're coming from.
and I need to, and I'm willing to even question what I hold dear.
Yes.
If there's a strong disagreement, and then reevaluate. I don't have to agree in the end.
Yeah.
Okay. But then there's also people, and I think Rachel Maddow or NPR, some of these people that almost never agree with what we have. I want to listen to them and say, I could learn from this person still, but I trust almost nothing they say.
Yeah.
But I still consider it. And I think maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe I'm taking an imbalance. And they're always going to side on this side of like compassion and obviously too authoritarian and when it comes to COVID and some of these other things. But they're not evil.
Yeah.
I mean, any more than we all are. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so they're not just trying to kill us. They want a good thing, and I can learn from them too. Okay. But I don't trust them.
Yeah.
And so what I feel like this whole conversation about is Allie Beth Stuckey in particular feels like she's in this close circle,
Yeah.
right? And so you don't just
does.
put your foot down for someone who's in the circle.
No.
But if someone's out there, and so the rule is not really like you can never put your foot down. It's like, dude, if you're putting your foot down for people in the circle, you need to chill.
Yeah.
Husband.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should be able to even let your wife, not even let.
Well, because
You
here's what
should
those.
be able to have conversations with your wife and be like,
Here's
what
what's
do
happening.
you think about this?
And I have seen husbands do this, and I've heard crazy horror stories too.
No,
is what those husbands are doing is they're shrinking that circle so small that it's really only them.
Yes.
I'm the only one who gets to have an influence over you,
No.
and that's twisted.
It is.
It's its own weird authoritarian.
No, that's to me what this
And that's the sin.
reeks of.
Yeah, okay, I get it.
And
I get it
that's
now.
why I think Allie Beth Stuckey
Yeah.
so vehemently pushes back, because she's like, okay, this person's probably in a semi-abusive situation.
Yeah.
At least some sort of emotional just manipulation, that type of stuff. And I'm not saying you can get all of that, but if I was to make an assumption, if I was to bet on like this person, I'd be like, there's a lot of unhealth there. A lot of sin that is present.
Part of my assumption on that, listening to that clip, and I've listened to her, not a ton and not in a while, was the irony of her being accused of being brash and loud, and her response was to laugh and mock. And I was like, geez, it's kind of on the nose here, Allie. I'm not sure what you're going for.
Also, she does mock, and it's funny. Like, that's the thing. She's one of the few, and I say this kind of with a lot of, like, this is going to sound super sexist. I don't find a lot of women very funny, to be honest. Like, when it comes to comedians, there's a few exceptions though that have really.
But she's not a comedian.
Like, but no, she does. She does. Like, she actually has some really good. Like, I've seen her in like these satirical like videos.
Okay.
Where she is doing like a full like comedy routine, and it's kind of funny.
What's the net? What I mean,
It's just on the Blaze. Like,
she's on the Blaze. Okay.
She does a few things with the Blaze where she does have this level of sarcasm that can be funny at times.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't care. I mean, I don't know. Like, is it a sin for a woman to be sarcastic? Like, no, I don't think so. Like, I think like if what you're saying is worthy of being mocked, like she's not your wife.
Joan the Baptist. Huh?
Maybe it is a sin for you, like if you're the wife, to mock the husband. I mean, that's probably
that's
the
yeah.
sin.
I think that was part of it.
But I don't think it's necessarily like a sin for a woman to mock a man.
No,
you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of men who deserve it.
There's a lot of men who
Maybe
deserve
that
it.
husband does.
And maybe he does. And honestly, like,
how small are you shrinking that circle of influence of your wife? Because that's a domineering for sure.
It is. And I actually see it. And I actually think the reason why she is probably pretty sensitive to it, and you brought this up, is that it is actually a sign that you look for in abuse. Like, one of the things you actually look for are like, wait, is your wife allowed to talk does she have friends?
Right.
Like,
Yeah,
this is interesting. Like this whole, and you can usually sense it. Like,
But part of it, and this, I think maybe this is Oregon too, is I feel like that is so rare. And that's why it's like, okay, maybe this is that rare case. Or maybe...
I mean, I've ran into it.
Maybe Werry's Law is at work. I'm not really sure. We'll see. The time will tell.
That's true.
Werry's Law says there are no exceptions. We'll find out. All right. Hey, you've been listening to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke and David. If you enjoyed this episode or you found some... I feel like if you're still listening, you need a like. It's been an hour and a half. You owe us the click. If not, the subscribe. All right. So, hey, share it with a friend.
Also, rate it. That's the biggest thing.
That's right.
That's
5
the biggest.
stars.
5-star rating is the biggest thing.
That's right. If you want to help us, give it a 5-star rating. Share it with a friend. And most of all, I think the whole point of what we're doing here is start a good conversation.
Yeah.
Dig a little deeper.
Be willing to have conversations that you're just a little uncomfortable having.
I know. That's the fun.
That's to me. I'm always uncomfortable having these conversations. I'm like, I don't want my wife,
I don't
want my wife to hate me, you know.
All right.
She's like,
hey,
I'm just kidding.
Our wives aren't listening anyway. Hey, dig a little deeper and think again.
I'm like, as soon as we started talking about Ali Beth I'm like, oh man, like she was like her favorite show.
The untouchable topic. All right. Hey, dig a little deeper, think again. We will see you next time.
All right.